For this lecture, we're discussing the practice of historical archaeology. So, historical archaeology means the study of human behavior through material culture or material remains, but it involves cases in which written history in some way affects its interpretation. In this case, documentary sources can be superior sometimes to archaeology, but they can also be quite selective and biased. For example, slave owners wrote very little about the day-to-day life of enslaved peoples because they didn't think that it was important. Therefore, we must view archaeological and documentary sources as equally valid yet independent lines of evidence. This means that ambiguities between the two are important as well as each piece of information alone. Early on, historical archaeologists tended to focus on the reconstruction and restoration of famous homes, forts, and other military sites, for example, colonial Williamsburg. Beginning in the 1960s, we see the development of federal legislation requiring what's called cultural resource management, or CRM, and that's something we'll cover in the next lecture. This led to a boom in systematic excavation of historic sites, as well as the use of independent artifact-based methods for dating sites and components of those sites. Some of the distinguishing characteristics of historical archaeology from prehistoric archaeology include what might be referred to as a post-processual slant, and this means that because we have access to texts, ethnohistoric data, and/or oral traditions, it makes it possible for us to learn about the meanings of symbols, the ethnic affiliation of particular individuals, the income differences, the composition of different families, and political restrictions, at least would have been written down in the books. And that provides us with a greater understanding of the context within which the material remains we find can be interpreted. Another difference or distinguishing characteristic is that in historical archaeology we tend to deal with shorter time periods. These documentary sources can provide more precise dates for a site's use as well as how its use changed over time. This also can allow us to focus on specific individuals and events that were part of the larger processes that were happening. And then lastly, historical cases are investigating things that happen very close to us. They're very close in time, and therefore there are a lot more emotions perhaps that are involved in the issues that are being discussed. So a discussion of recent history is embedded within the same cultural, political, and ethical challenges that we're facing in the modern world today. Some of the themes in historical archaeology include studies that tend to focus on historically disenfranchised groups or minority groups, so for example, African, Asian, Hispanic, and Native Americans. These studies work to then uncover the history of people whose histories are still ignored, only partially recorded, or related in some kind of biased manner. Another theme is that archaeologists commonly tackle questions about the recent past that history books answer unsatisfactorily. In this sense, they can be seen sometimes as crime scene detectives who collect data to resolve disputes over key historical events. And then lastly, much of the research that's being done in historical archaeology looks at the nature of European colonialism and its effects on indigenous populations. In this case, some use this research to challenge the standard public perceptions of mainstream history. For example, here in the Southwest, there was a covert resistance among Pueblo communities over Spanish rule. This is what's called the Pueblo Revolt. So this is something that we're able to look at from both the historic documents as well as the archaeological evidence. So when it comes to African American history, it's inextricably linked to slavery, especially when we take a look at plantations. Now, plantation archaeology actually began back in 1931 at the site of Mount Vernon, which is George Washington's home in Virginia. The director of research at that time was interested in restoring the structures. They wanted to locate the various structural remains on the property and therefore conducted extensive and systematic survey and testing. This helped them to reconstruct the garden and outbuildings. But prior to the 1980s, few restored plantations dealt with the issue of slavery explicitly. Guides were often instructed to refer to enslaved peoples as servants rather than what they were. In this way, then, slave archaeology actually began around the 1960s, which drew from the inspiration of other social upheavals at the time. Charles Fairbanks was the first to study the institution of slavery based on the archaeology of coastal plantations in Georgia and Florida. He emphasized the richness and diversity of Southern heritage, which was a clear departure from this traditional melting pot theme. And the archaeologists at this time set out to dispel myths concerning the biological and cultural inferiority used to legitimize the continued segregation and discrimination of African American peoples. Today, African American archaeology helps uncover information about aspects of slave life on which the documentary sources are often quite silent. Historical archaeology, therefore, is the study of human behavior through material remains in which written history in some way affects interpretation, as I said from the start. Your textbook actually talks about a few examples of how historical archaeologists have sought to investigate such cases involving information from both documentary sources and archaeological data. So for your activity, what I want you to do is read through all 3 of the case studies that are in the textbook. I want you to choose one for further investigation by answering the questions that you see listed here. So go ahead, type up your response, and upload it into Canvas.